Okay, so welcome to the seminar again. It's really nice to have you all. So today we're going to have Mik with us, who is going to present his dissertation study, which is pretty hot and very new. It's defended just last month. So we're going to listen to that. But before that, there are a few comments to just housekeeping purpose. So the session will be recorded. So during the seminar, during the talk, feel free to turn off your camera and stay mute yourself. And the recording will be available on our YouTube site at the department for those people who wanted to come but couldn't make it. So that's one thing. And if I may, I'm very glad and particularly pleasure to introduce Mik Fanguy, who is going to be soon to be an alumni member of the department. So waiting for the graduation in next summer. He has just successfully defended his thesis last month, as I said, and today is the whole talk is about that. And he is an education technology researcher and actively publishing a lot of articles on this topic of collaborative note-taking. And he's also an invited professor in the English as a Foreign Language Department at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology in South Korea, which we call KAIST in Korea. So I welcome Mik. So we're going to have roughly 45 minutes talk, followed by discussion and Q&A. So if you have any questions during listening to him, feel free to type if you can, or you can also raise your hands later on after the talk during the Q&A time. So having said that, Mik, do you want to come in? The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Kyungmi. That's a great introduction, and I'm very pleased to be here. So thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to talk to you today about my dissertation research. So let me just share my screen with you just a minute. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides. That's the goal. Okay, good. So I'm going to talk to you today about collaborative note-taking and its effects on learning performance. So this is the topic I've really been working with for a couple of years now. This is what I've been publishing papers on. And I think it could be interesting for you to learn more about collaborative note-taking if you might want to try something like this in your classes. It could be something that really helps people to recall what they're learning, and also it adds an element of collaboration to the classes. It allows students to work together and really collaborate in these online environments in particular, which can be quite isolating. So if you have any questions about what I'm talking about today, feel free to send me an email at mik@kaist.edu. Also, I was thinking that just for fun, no pressure with this at all, but yeah, you can see that Jonathan's already just shared my link in the chat. And if you want, you could try clicking on this link. And if you do, then you will see a Google document that looks like this. And if you want, you could just take notes together with other attendees on things that I'm talking about. Of course, there's no exam here, so it's no pressure, very low stakes. But I just thought I would put that there so you could understand what I'm talking about when I talk about online collaborative note-taking. Okay, so I'll go ahead and just, I'll skip some of this introduction because Kyungmi's done a nice job of already introducing me, that she's my supervisor. But one thing I do want to tell you about myself is that I teach a class called Scientific Writing at KAIST. That's the primary class that I teach. And all the students at KAIST major in science and engineering fields. So this is just a research writing class that they're required to take as graduate students to publish, scientific research articles in journals in their field. And all the data I've collected for these studies comes directly from those classes that I teach about scientific writing, okay? So that's kind of a context thing that I wanted to mention. Also, I was asked by the organizers to talk a little bit about, I guess, research background and funding and things like that. So I don't really have a lot of good news with funding. So the thing is, it's really hard in South Korea to get funding if you don't already have a PhD. So hopefully having gotten a PhD, it's going to be better for me to get funding because I'll be allowed to apply for federal grants here from the NRF. I did get a little bit of funding from some of my colleagues that ended up working with me on this project who have permanent tenure track jobs. And sometimes there's ways they can write themselves into your project on grants, institutional grants from their side. So I've been included as like a co-investigator in a couple of university grants. So that's I haven't really had a lot of good luck with funding, but one thing I can say is that the type of research I do is highly collaborative, which makes sense since I'm researching collaboration. So you really work with a lot of different types of people, statisticians, educational researchers, computer scientists. There's really, that would be my message, is that one really good way to get into this type of research and hopefully find funding is through collaboration. So if I were to think about how to explain online collaborative note-taking, I think a good place to start with that would be note-taking itself. That's something we all know about quite a bit because it's a ubiquitous strategy. We see it all over the place. People take notes in almost every kind of class, or especially in universities, but particularly when the courses involve lectures, you see a lot of people taking notes, and the research there's a huge amount of research showing that note-taking has a positive effect on people's learning outcome, how much they can remember, how much they can recall, their understanding. One maybe issue with note-taking that we can think about is that trying to listen to what someone says and then to write down the notes, and at the same time trying to understand what you're hearing and writing about, that is what we would call a cognitively demanding activity. And it can be demanding to the point that it overwhelms somebody's working memory. It provides too much stimulation, and you end up not remembering very well and maybe not even understanding very well. So that could be one issue with a rather effective strategy of note-taking, is that sometimes it's a bit much for our minds to handle it. So note-taking is often viewed from a cognitive perspective of the encoding storage paradigm. So this is a paradigm, you can think of that as just a theoretical framework that was introduced by DeVesta and Gray back in 1972. And it just comes down to two simple concepts. The first concept is that when you write down something, that process of writing down causes you to link materials that you're writing down into your existing cognitive structure, and that can make it meaningful to you. It helps you to remember, to move things from your working memory, which is just your memory while you're doing a task, to your long-term memory. So you can recall it later if you are tested, if you have an exam or you have any need of that information later. So when you encode, which means just writing the notes in order to remember what you're writing, you create storage. That's just the written record of everything that you have written down. It's your notes, that you can use that to supplement your imperfect memory so that you don't have to try to remember everything that was said. You can use this storage of information, especially when you are reviewing for an exam, or, if you want to remember what you've heard in a lecture. So I think one thing we can say about collaborative note-taking is that it might be able to help relieve some of this burden that comes from note-taking, right? Because if you think about it, the burden really comes from encoding, that you're trying to write something while listening and while trying to understand, right? That's the cognitively demanding part. So if you could share that encoding with others, right? If you could work with others, maybe as you're doing now in the Google Doc, it's a little bit less cognitively demanding. You're not responsible for writing everything. Other people can write something and you can work together, and it may help relieve that burden. So here you can see a real example of collaborative notes from my class. And here you can see the writers have marked their writing in different colors. So we can see that there are 3 writers here. You can see somebody wrote in blue, somebody wrote in purple, and somebody wrote in red. And so there's 3 writers, and you can see the person in blue seems to have done the lion's share of the writing here. Okay. But also, we can see some cases where the purple student wrote something and then where the red student wrote something. So there's a little bit of input from everybody. Nobody has to do everything. And you can even see that sometimes they put embedded comments and have a little conversation about what they're learning on the side. Okay, so this is what it looks like when you take collaborative notes. This was done in Google Documents, but really any kind of online shared document platform would work. Okay. And then, well, the great thing about that is they can all share the storage when it's over with. So they share the encoding, so it's less demanding, but they have access to this great storage later. So I think a good question to ask, though, it looks like a good practice. Is it actually beneficial? So there wasn't much prior literature before my dissertation project. There wasn't really a lot of work being done on collaborative note-taking, in part because it's kind of a new technology. I think the Google Docs platform wasn't really available to the public until 2009, and it really wasn't very mainstream. So it took time for these kind of online documents to become widely used as they are now, and then eventually for collaborative note-taking to become a common practice. But there were a couple prior works that have shown that collaborative note-taking was beneficial to students' grades, to their sort of measured performance in classes. And then there was recently some studies that suggest that maybe collaborative note-taking leads to a more equitable environment because people can give their opinions and they can share. The problem is that the studies that were done so far, they didn't really look into any of the underlying mechanisms or reasons for the advantages of collaborative note-taking. So they could tell you that the prior studies could say that collaborative note takers did comparatively well to a control group. They could say that collaborative note takers seem to have some benefit, but no studies really looked at the notes themselves. No studies really analyzed the types of collaborative behaviors that students were using, the kind of collaborative strategies that they used when they took notes. So the problem is we really didn't know why note-taking worked or how it worked, and maybe what good notes would look like, or how to recommend a sound procedure for taking collaborative notes. Like, what would be a good practice? How should people behave in their groups in order to get the most value out of their note-taking experience? So that's really what this study will seek to do. So the research that you do see on collaborative note-taking is different than you see in other note-taking studies. So when we look at note-taking studies that deal with individuals, they always seem to look at note-taking from a cognitivist perspective, encoding and storage that I talked about before. Collaborative note-taking, when you do see a study about that, they usually look at it from some kind of social constructivist point of view, usually CSCL, computer-supported collaborative learning. Those kinds of studies, those kind of theoretical frameworks tend to consider that learning happens mainly in 2 ways. One way would be in the collaborative processes that people engage in, right? When they work together, there are these collaborative processes that lead to learning, the sharing of ideas, right? And then the second way would be that groups create knowledge together. And I guess in computer-supported collaborative learning, that group knowledge is often thought of as an artifact, like a digital artifact, like some kind of digital document, or I don't know, PowerPoint, or some kind of website, blog, some kind of digital product, right? So when we compare these existing theoretical perspectives that I've mentioned, the encoding storage paradigm or computer-supported collaborative learning, they both provide something, but there's a problem with each view. If you think about the encoding storage paradigm that I explained before, one reason that it's the most widely used framework in note-taking research is because it gives us a nice explanatory mechanism for how note-taking leads to improved recall. How does that information get from that note-taking process into your long-term memory? But why hasn't that encoding storage paradigm been used in collaborative note-taking research? That's what I found interesting. And I think one reason may be that researchers might find that paradigm insufficient to consider the complex social interactions and relationships that occur during collaborative processes. It just doesn't explain that, and it doesn't help with that. So, the good thing about computer-supported collaborative learning is that it accounts for these complex collaborative interactions and processes that I mentioned. The problem, though, is that it lacks an explanation of a cognitive mechanism that leads to improved recall. So there isn't a very clear understanding of like how and why note-taking leads to improved recollection of what you're learning. So I think both of these have something to offer, but neither has the whole story. So I guess a question I was asking myself is then how do you harmonize this cognitivist perspective with social constructivism? And so I think one way I like to think about this is that when we talked about encoding before, the process of writing down information to remember it, I think when we do that collaboratively, that could be considered as a collaborative process that leads to learning. I think that's how maybe social constructivism would view such a thing. If you have a bunch of people encoding within a document, maybe that's part of their collaborative process that leads to learning. And then on the other hand, storage, we talked about storage just being the notes that you produce, the digital artifact, if you will. Yeah, I think that's what social constructivism might think of as the generation of group knowledge, in the form of a digital artifact. So I'm sort of roughly equating these things in trying to make a new framework here, because so I think if we are looking at collaborative note-taking, then we have to think about how we would sort of measure encoding. What does encoding even mean in a collaborative document? If it's just one person writing, we know what encoding means. It's when you're writing and then that leads to you remembering what you write, okay? But in a group, what does that even look like? So I came up with some variables that kind of explain some of the collaborative processes that happen when people take notes. For example, one of the things we could look at is volume, right? How many words does each person write? And then again, how many words does the whole group write? So you could have an individual variable of how many words did student A write or student B, and you could have a group variable. How much did the whole group write? Another variable I looked at is, and I kind of came up with here, is turn taking, which is how often do people respond to one another's writing? It's kind of a measure of interactivity. And we can measure that by looking at how often the authorship switches in a given document, right? So how often is the text interleaved between authors within the document? And then, another one would be edits of others. That's another maybe form of encoding, group encoding here, collaborative encoding, where this would sort of look at the amount of writing that a student changes that somebody else wrote. So it's like when you go into somebody else's writing and you erase something and you write something, that's the edits of other variable, and we can quantify that by how much was edited. And this can also be a individual variable. We can look at per student, but we can also look at it per group, how much editing happened. And of course, the last one is just login sessions, which means how often did the students and the group log in to write something in the document. And this tells us something about how sustained the process is. Did they just go into the document and write everything in one shot? Or did they go back to that document repeatedly and keep writing? With storage, I think a simple measure we can use that I used was the completeness of the notes. So what I was doing is just to read the notes and sort of evaluate how many points from the lecture the students were able to represent in their notes. So I developed rubrics and that corresponded to video instruction, and I graded the notes for their comprehensiveness or their completeness as a measure of the quality of the storage they produced. So like the encoding storage paradigm is based on two main concepts, encoding and storage, which we've talked about. Computer supported collaborative learning, as I mentioned, they talk about the collaborative processes that groups engage in that lead to learning. They talk about the generation of group knowledge, maybe in the form of a digital artifact. So I'm proposing a new variation of this paradigm called the collaborative encoding storage paradigm. And it sort of looks at encoding as a collaborative process that could be explained through these types of variables that I'm measuring. And in each of these variables, as I mentioned, can be viewed at an individual level or a group level. And then collaborative storage is another one, because this one can only be viewed at a group level. And what it means is the entire set of notes that's produced by the group, and particularly the quality of those notes as measured by their completeness. So to get these kinds of variables, to get this kind of information, I did a lot of research with learning analytic tools like DocuViz. I used a freeware program called DocuViz that's a Google Chrome add-on for Google Docs, and it tracks the contributions to a document over time. And so you can actually see these are login sessions. So you can see how often each student logged in, and you can see when those logins happened, and you can see how many logins for the total group if you were to count the total number of little squares here. You can see how much people wrote in the volume, and you can also see how much editing was done of each other's writing through these edits right here. So the DocuViz was a really good program for me to kind of harvest data from the documents that I was looking at, the note-taking documents that my students produced. And I had to develop my own software with a co-author to sort of count turns, because there was actually no definition for turn taking in collaborative writing before this project. That turn taking was a concept that existed in collaborative activities like conversation or other types of activities, but it didn't have a definition in writing, which was weird. So I sort of made this definition of how often the text is interleaved among authors. And so if you were to count the turns in this example, if you consider that each color represents a different student contribution, then you could count a turn here. This is one turn. This is two. This is three. This is four. This is five. This is six. This is seven. This is eight. This is nine. This is 10. There's 10 turns. And the blue student only took one turn. The brown student took like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like that. So that's how I ended up counting the turns. And we developed software that could automatically count the turns, because it's okay to count 10 turns by hand as I did there, but I was working with over 3,500 documents, so it was impossible. So I needed to make software that could do it automatically, right? And I'll talk more about that software in a minute. So my study really sought to understand collaborative note-taking along 3 dimensions in relation to encoding and storage. So first thing is, how does encoding affect storage? So what that means is, how does the process of your writing affect the product of the note that you produce? Like, that's what I was looking at. How do all those aspects of collaborative note-taking affect your the quality of the notes that you produce as a group? And then how does encoding affect individual learning performance? So like, that just means, how does the kind of encoding processes that we talked about already, how does that affect your, let's say, score on exams or grades in the class? And then how does storage, the quality of your storage, the quality of your notes, how does that affect your learning? So I'm trying to figure out like what really has more impact on learning. And then I want to know what good notes look like, good collaborative notes. What do they look like? And what would be an effective process that I could recommend to my students when they take notes so they get better learning outcomes? So I had some research questions and hypotheses, but just to save time, let's skip straight to the hypotheses. These are simple. I just thought that when students engage in more collaborative encoding behaviors, they're going to perform better on quizzes at the individual level. If they do that at the group level, they're going to perform better on quizzes. They're going to have better recall. And when groups engage in more collaborative behaviors, they are going to produce more complete notes. And when they have more complete notes, they're going to do better on quizzes. So the hypotheses are pretty straightforward. I just thought more collaboration is better. Better notes are better. That's pretty simple. That's what I expected. So the methods were like this. I was teaching a scientific writing course, as I mentioned, and it was kind of a mixed method or mixed model kind of online class where we had live Zoom meetings, but also there was this asynchronous learning component where people were watching pre-recorded videos, usually like 4 or 5 videos per week, maybe like 10 minutes long each video. I think they watched about a total of 52 videos during the 10-week teaching period semester. And I made Google Documents for all these groups. So I let students select into groups. I tried to get the groups to be, all the groups were within 3 to 5 students because research suggests that's a good number for this type of activity. And I made Google Docs that the groups could share 1 document per instructional week. So each group had 10 Google Documents in which to take notes. And at the end of each week, each student took an exam that was testing them on their knowledge of the lecture video content. And so their notes could actually help them, hopefully, to do that, to do well with that. And then the collaboration data, like the collaborative encoding data, was mined from the Google Documents using DocuViz and using the turn counting software that I mentioned before. And completeness had to be scored by a human rater. That was a painstaking job. That was huge. And I enlisted a lot of help. What little funding I got for the project went into training and hiring people to do that, making sure we had a reliable rubric, making sure all the raters were normed properly. Okay. So the data was collected during 4 semesters in 2019, 2020. So basically spring and fall semester of those 2 years. A total of 357 graduate students at KAIST were participating. And, the students had an average age of 27 because they are graduate students, so they're a bit older. So let me tell you about the results. Let me tell you what it revealed and what we learned. So, the first research question was, what is the relationship between collaborative note-taking behaviors and learning performance at the individual level? So what that means is, if people take notes inside of a group, let's say a student A takes notes, how do these collaborative encoding behaviors like volume, sessions, edits, turn taking, how does that affect their scores on subsequent exams? And what I found is that with respect to the performance of individual group members, the intensity of collaborative encoding sessions is more important than frequency. So let me explain what that means. So here you see these squares, and what I'm trying to indicate here is that the green squares mean that I found a significant positive correlation between that variable and exam scores. So it means that for an individual learner like student A, he or she, if they write more words, they get a better score on the exam than if they didn't write many words. And edits of others, same thing. If they edited a lot of their partner's writing, then they got a better score. And if they took lots of turns, if they took many turns, if they responded to or sort of interleaved their text with the writing of others, they got a better score. But notice that sessions is yellow, which means there was no correlation at all here. So what it means is it doesn't matter. It didn't matter at the individual level how often the students went into the document to write. They didn't have to sustain their contribution over time. It didn't matter. But if they wrote a lot, if they were productive, and also if they were interactive, like these variables here are really interactive, like you're editing the work of other people or you're responding to their work by taking turns. This stuff was predictive of this stuff correlated positively with improved learning performance at the individual level. Okay. But then we also need to look at this at the group level, because, you know, you have the individual level, what happens to the individual students, but then we can also look at the group. We can look at the whole group and look at all the variables at the group level. And we can also sort of look at an average of the quiz scores at the group level. And it's quite different what we found then when we zoom out to the group level, because what we see is that volume and sessions have no correlation with quiz scores at the group level. Turn taking does. Edits of others is red, and you can guess that the red color means that it's negatively and significantly correlated with quiz scores at the group level. So really, to summarize this result, it is that with respect to the group, the learning performance of the whole group, interaction is a vital component of collaborative encoding, but only when it is additive rather than subtractive. Let me explain what I mean by that. So at the group level, volume didn't matter, which was surprising. It didn't matter how much the group really wrote. It had no correlation. It didn't matter how often they logged into the document to write something. That had no effect on their scores. But turn taking gives a positive value to their learning performance, and edits of others has a negative one. So what this actually may mean is that interaction can be good among the group members, but only when it's additive, only when you're adding text to the pool, not when you're taking away, not when you're removing something or changing something that somebody else wrote at the group level. Because this can actually cause some friction and some problems within a group. Some people really didn't like having their writing changed by others. This showed up later in subsequent interviews. When people change the writing of others inside of a group, some people feel like it's very unfair, feel like it's not, they're being ignored, or they're being sort of denied their ability to say something. And that causes some group members to lose trust in the process and lose trust in the document. So, you know, if you compare this to the prior slide, this is interesting. Keep your eye here and notice that at the individual level, edits of others is positive. At the group level, negative. What does that mean? It would be advisable for an individual to edit the work of others if he or she wants to get a better grade in a class. However, doing that would be detrimental to his or her group mates' learning performance. So this is an example of something that, you know, we can take away. It's like, yeah, this might be positive at the individual level, but it's definitely negative at the group level. So we wouldn't really want to advise our students to do too many of these kind of subtractive edits. So again, interaction is a vital component. The interactive variables are very, they have an effect here, but additive rather than subtractive, if you can see what I mean by that. Feel free to hit me with a question anytime, because I know this may be sometimes hard to understand, but I'm trying to make it clear if I can. Okay, and then the third result is, what is the relation? Okay, so the question was, what is the relationship between collaborative behaviors and note-taking completeness? So basically, how does encoding affect storage in a collaborative document? So this is at a group level, because we can only look at completeness at a group level. So with respect to the quality of the notes, the quality of the storage, groups should engage in a productive and sustained approach to encoding, but not a highly interactive one. So this means, depending on your goal with note-taking, because you could have two goals. One goal, a normal goal, would be to get a better score on the test. Okay, if you want to get a better score on the test, then it's good to write a lot at the individual level, and it's good to interact a lot at the group level. But if your goal is another goal you could have with note taking is to produce a really high quality note taking document, to make a really great record of the notes. If that's your goal, then you really want to write a lot of words, and you want to sustain that writing over a long period of time with frequent sessions. That's what's important. What's interesting is that our more collaborative, interactive variables here have no effect. So what this means is that you might want to implement a cooperative rather than collaborative approach to note taking if your goal is to make a really good set of notes. Cooperative means that you work together with group members to create something. You have a common goal, but you don't necessarily want to interact very much. So you sort of divide up the task. You take notes on this part, you take notes on that part, and then we'll put this together and we'll share the benefits of this final document that we make. A collaborative approach would be, let's sort of all get involved with each part and let's work together and respond to one another. But that's not what we want to do here. If we want to make a great note-taking document, we should focus on writing a lot. We should focus on writing often, but not necessarily interacting with one another very much. We can use a divide and conquer approach if we want to make great quality notes. And lastly, what's the relationship between completeness and learning performance at the group level? Well, collaborative note-taking groups that produce higher quality storage, in other words, better notes, they do better on exams than those who do not. So that wasn't too surprising, but there you go. So I want to give two big recommendations that I think could be useful to practitioners, anybody who might want to incorporate collaborative note-taking as a learning strategy in your class. To improve students' learning performance, I think you should encourage groups to increase the amount of their note writing. Try to get them to write more, but not necessarily the frequency of their writing sessions. They don't have to write frequently. And then remember that for groups, you want to encourage them to make additive changes rather than subtractive changes. So if they want to respond to somebody, it's better to write a response, write more, rather than erasing what somebody wrote or taking something away, because of some group dynamic problems that happen, as I mentioned before. And also, when you're trying to get students to create a high quality set of notes, if that's your goal, then you want to encourage the groups to engage in a sustained, productive writing process. And this does not have to be highly interactive. So get people to write a lot, get people to write often, but they don't necessarily have to interact and collaborate very much, because sometimes that can be distracting to the actual process of writing the notes. So I'll sort of wind this down a little bit. I want to talk about some of the contributions of the project as I see it. There are really 5 types of contributions that we can talk about here. I think there was a knowledge component, a theoretical contribution. There's a pedagogy component, technology, and methodology. Let me briefly hit on each of these. Okay, the knowledge contribution is that I think there are many complex interactions that learners engage in when they do anything collaboratively. Of course, this is true when they take notes collaboratively. But those kinds of interactions and processes have never been rigorously investigated or clearly conceptualized. Generally, like I said, the existing studies, they just tended to look at the result to say that collaborative note takers did well, they did better than a control group. But they didn't really tell us like what successful collaboration looks like, or what types of collaborative behaviors are more successful than others, or so that's something that was needed. And the present study helps to fill this gap, because this was a systematic investigation of the collaborative processes that students use when taking notes collaboratively, and of the quality of notes that they produce. So this was the rare study that actually looks at the notes themselves and actually evaluates what those notes contained and their quality. That this is something that I think makes the study rigorous, and so it offers this knowledge contribution. It sort of tells you what good collaborative notes will be, what collaborative notes should probably look like in order to be effective, and what kind of processes will be effective for students learning. Now, the theoretical contribution is the one that I mentioned before, the collaborative encoding storage paradigm. I just think that it enabled the examination of the effectiveness of various forms of collaborative encoding on learning performance at the level of the individual and the group. And I think this framework offered a more nuanced explanation and a more detailed explanation of collaborative encoding behaviors on learning performance and note quality than was offered by the prior frameworks that I talked about earlier. So I think that's a theoretical contribution. And then I think there was a pedagogical aspect of contribution as well, because I was able to give some recommendations to practitioners that I talked about before on how to implement this practice into your classroom, and also for learners. I just think for learners to know how their approaches to collaboration can affect their own learning experiences, but also how their experiences can affect the learning of their group members, because they obviously can have an impact on how group members learn. So this research kind of helps to understand that better too. And then there's a technological aspect of contribution, because this project also resulted in the creation of 2 software tools that I think instructors can use and researchers can use if they want to implement collaborative note-taking in their classes. So one of them was a Google document creation software and sharing software. So it allows you to automatically make thousands of Google documents instantly and to share them with pre-selected Google accounts of students that are in your class. And that was super helpful for me because, like I said, I was dealing with almost 4,000 documents. So making those by hand is impossible. And also I need to have, those documents need to contain some instructions. They need to be shared with the right people. And I also need to have access to them so I can monitor what's going on and so I can collect data. So I think that software is valuable, and my co-author and I are providing that as freeware. We've already presented these at computer science conferences and written papers about them there. And then there was the turn counting software that I think is useful, definitely for researchers and maybe for instructors also that just want to see the level of interaction that they get in the documents to see if students are really interacting. And then finally, there was a methodological contribution, because research on collaboration, as you can see, can be complicated because you kind of need to analyze data at a multi-level analysis. You need to be able to see things happening because you have data at the individual level that's then nested in a group level, right? So you have a variable like edits of others. Students are doing that at an individual level, but then there's a group level of edits of others that we want to look at. So sort of being able to conceptualize data at this multi kind of level is important. So yeah, a couple co-authors and I came up with this novel 5-step statistical model. We call it the CFC, is the Courtney-Fungy-Costley protocol to analyze behaviors. Yeah, this is my friend Matt Courtney, a great statistician, and a co-author of mine, Jamie Costley. So we actually published our statistical method in a journal called Methods X that it just publishes papers about methods. So you can read more about this method if you want. I won't really have time to go through that now, but I will just say a couple words of limitation. This study did not examine back channel communications that students may have engaged in. In other words, if they were calling each other on the phone or texting outside of the Google Docs suite, or maybe they were meeting in person, we don't know. And that's because we just didn't have a good way to look into back channel communications. Furthermore, I don't think we have the right to look into that too much, because I think that's personal, private communication between students. So I wasn't interested in doing that. But I think that's something to think about, because the back channel communication could be important to their learning process, and we just can't really account for it. Embedded comments were not analyzed because there were very few of them. So that's something. And then, overall statistical correlations were quite low at the group level. and they were somewhat low at the individual level. And there's a reason for this. At the group level, there wasn't a lot of variation in how many words groups tended to write. They tended to produce very similar looking documents. There wasn't as much variation, and that causes correlations to be a little bit smaller. So in future research, we're looking into more sophisticated measure of completeness. We're working on better completeness rubrics that will allow us to get more accurate information about how good the notes are, and also allow us to look at completeness at the individual level. But that's kind of future research. So there were a few, like I say, publications from the project. You see, this was kind of my main one from the dissertation. It's under review now, and but yeah, we published a few papers in interactive learning environments. There were 2 in the internet and higher education, the one in Methods X I mentioned about our method, and yeah, ET-R&D, as well as a couple of computer science papers we published about the software we're providing, freeware. So if you want to use that software, everything you need in those documents there. So that's kind of it for me. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to have questions if you have any.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, thank you so much, Mik. I think if you want, you can stop sharing your screen. So we're going to move on to, the discussion phase of the seminar now. But before doing that, I just wish to say it was really nice to supervise this guy, and as you can see, it has been he's been very productive. So and it's great that when he started his study, it was it was very complex, and then data set was disastrously too massive, but it was really nice to observe and support the process for him to figure out what he can do out of it. So it was a great honor to supervise him, and also he presented it really well today. So I just wanted to have a little sneak note like that as supervisor. And then now we're going to go for the questions. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to raise your hands or put in the chat, which I can all see. And if you feel comfortable, actually, I think we can just turn on the camera. The recording will have only me on, but at least we can see each other. So that way create some better sense of social presence that we know. Okay, so I will probably give you a couple of minutes to think about the questions. I know it's pretty overwhelming, and Mik has tried to throw a lot of ideas all together coming from the massive dissertation work. So you can take a couple of minutes while I can ask my question. Mik, I thought it would be useful for you to explain a little bit about your strategy in terms of how to group students. And I know just through our interaction that you have changed your strategy a few times for different reasons. It's a massive number of students. So do you want to say something about what worked really well, what didn't work in terms of grouping them?
Oh yeah, thanks for the question. Sure, I'll talk about grouping. So originally I used to teach this class face-to-face prior to the pandemic. So grouping was kind of easy in the sense that I would just tell the students, try to get in a group of 4, and they would just group up, at different tables. But then during the pandemic, I tried initially grouping people myself, and I didn't like that. And I wanted people to be able to group in to select into groups easily. So I made a kind of application on our course learning management system where people could select into a group. They could actually click a button to click into a group, and then their choice was then visible to everybody in the class, and they could change their choice up to a point. But then eventually at some point there was a lock-in date where they'd be locked in with their group members. And it was important to lock them in as a group because I was also, as part of this study, I was looking at how collaboration sort of evolves over time. And there was one paper in that group of papers I mentioned before that showed that collaboration actually improves over time. Like the value of collaboration increases on the learning effect over time. And it really takes about 8 weeks to really start seeing the benefit of collaboration that we get. So so basically students could choose their groups. They could see where their friends are. They could, so if they had pre-existing friendships, it was okay to get with those people, but then eventually they were locked in to a group of 4 or maybe 5 if there was an odd number. And then sometimes you'd have people drop out of the class, but we tried to keep it at 3 as a minimum, based on the research that I read on this. It's 3 to 5 is kind of an optimal number for this kind of project. Yeah.
Thank you. So I can't see any hand raised. So that means that, okay, and Mary, do you want to come in?
I'm always happy to come in with a question. Thank you, Mick. I missed the very beginning of your presentation, so apologies for that. But I found it fascinating. It's opened up all sorts of questions in my mind. I'm particularly interested when you were just talking there about, the students choosing their own groups and having particular ways and things. But actually, I was, as you were talking, I was also interested in thinking, there are some students who, for a whole host of reasons, might struggle to share their writing with other people. I've been talking to some of our own postgraduate students who perhaps have a specific learning difficulty and who have that challenge of sharing their work, even with their supervisor, let alone a peer. And I wondered if and how you sort of addressed or explored that particular aspect at all, and how you'd manage that. Yeah,
I think that's a good question and a fair question. And so initially back in 2019, I started trying to do this kind of work, and I was very sort of hands off and just let the students write what they will. And I thought they would write a lot and I would get a lot of notes. And I found that they didn't write very much. It was kind of a disaster. That was something when I first met Kyungmi, that's pretty much what we were talking about. It's like, how can I, what we had to, this wasn't a very good project in the beginning. And so I need to encourage people to write, but I also don't want to police them to the extent that I'm forcing them to write something, because then I have nothing to measure, right? So what I ended up settling on is that I force people to write. I don't force, but I made it part of their grade. Now it's pass-fail class, so it's not a big deal, but I just tried to give some points within the class that you could earn if you wrote something. So it wasn't mandatory, but it was strongly encouraged through the grade system. However, if they wrote even just a little bit, even just 1 or 2, 3 words, they got that credit. So there was really minimal pressure, but I think I needed something just to get them to put a little bit of writing on the page, just to throw it out there. But it's notes, so it didn't really need to be much. In some cases you could just write in parentheses next to somebody's writing, really? ? Are you sure? And that could be notes. So it wasn't too hard for them to get involved. But that's kind of as far as I went. I didn't really have a good strategy for people with. I didn't really think about part of the thing you're asking me, but that's just what I did. Yeah,
that's interesting to hear your response. And of course, it does retain that same issue in terms of, well, how does one involve? And I think the reason, one of the other just quick points to say is that I think one of the reasons I was also asking that is that I know a number of years, well, a few years ago now, within the UK context, where students might have been being given what we call disabled students allowance to actually have a note taker provided for them. And obviously they would need to negotiate with that individual note taker to create the notes for them. Now that shift in making available materials that somebody might capture for themselves in their own individual notes, not the collaborative notes that you've spoken about, there was certainly some debate within the sector about whether students might be able to develop collaborative notes, which would be then available for students who might struggle to note take. So I can actually see that there's real potential connections, but it is thinking about who and how and what's going on. So you've given me lots of food for thought. So thank you.
Yeah, and just one more comment on to respond there, I think, and that's a great point. The research shows that the research that I've read on note-taking seems to show that when students have video recorded lectures like the ones I provided, and they can take notes asynchronously, this has been really good for people with disabilities. So I would think that that research combined with the fact that this is being done as a group, it must be good for them, but that's just an assumption.
Yeah, no, and you're right in terms of the importance of the asynchronous recordings to enable people to do. So, I mean, as you pointed out, there are a number of positive outcomes from your study. So thank you.
Thank you. We have one comment from the chat from Diane, actually, about the KAIST. She seems to understand what this context of the study actually, that actually it's really important for Mik, you can point out that what kind of students you're dealing with. We can't only say it's the usual student, because this is the university, really elitist, and all these great students from having the almost perfect score in STEM will go there. So Mik, do you want to clarify that one thing? So talking back to Diane.
Yeah, I guess it's pretty well known and famous university, very selective. It's like the 1% of 1% or whatever, and so it's like the people who do really, really well in their studies in Korea. And Korea's, you know, obviously a high achieving country in terms of all kinds of academic success, but yeah, this is the best of the best. So I'm routinely the dumbest guy in the room, and that's familiar for me. But it's really incredible to work with these students, but it's also hard because so it's like kind of easy in a way, because almost anything you do, they hit it out of the park every time. They're awesome. But what can be hard is getting a lot of variety of like a variety of contribution, because everybody does everything so well that was sort of like the problem I talked about with correlations, is that like all the groups turned in like amazing notes. And that's not necessarily helpful in a correlational study. It would be better if, to find correlations, it's almost better if you have some people that do relatively poor notes and some people that do really good notes, and then you can kind of see what the differences are. Here I was working with smaller differences, but I mean, in terms of a place to teach people, it's great because the students are amazing.
Thank you. That's helpful. So we have Ianya, whose hand is raised. Do you want to come in, please?
Yes, thank you, Kyung-mi, and thank you very much, Nick, for this really interesting talk. I have two questions. The first is around the quiz scores. So you said that you found weak correlations, and this is because of the volume and quality of the notes. I wonder what happened on the other side with the scores of the quizzes. Did everyone score quite high? And then if this is so, what are the nuances that we can actually then generalize out of this? And my second question is around, did you perhaps also do some sort of qualitative investigation if people liked this activity? So, perhaps this is building on Anne-Marie's question about personal preference, but also I think it might be really interesting to look at the relation between those that really like this activity and how it contributed to their learning, and then scores, and those that didn't. So did you look at that? And if not, would you do that in the future? Thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you for the questions. That's great. So, okay, the first question about quizzes. So yeah, you're right. The students tended to be high achievers, so they tended to do really well. But I was able to make the quizzes very challenging, and that was something I had to develop over many iterations prior to 2019. Nothing to do with my research. I just really needed quizzes to be really challenging. So I had some ways of doing that. Basically, not to get into too much detail about it, I made a lot of questions that would, like, for example, multiple choice questions that would have more than one correct answer. So select all that apply, and then getting partial credit for each answer option that was correct, but any wrong answer, you were penalized the entire point of the question. So you got 0. So that was really trying to discourage indiscriminate guessing and really make them work for it. And by doing that, I was able to make challenging learning measures that really caused them to also have to demonstrate the skills that they learned from the videos, to the knowledge to really apply it to new problems. And so that gave me, that was just my teaching practice, but I mean, that ended up giving me enough variation, because you'd have people that just, there are always people who don't watch the videos. And then that's sometimes, and I think sometimes collaborative notes may encourage that. But that can be okay too, because if the notes are really, really well done, it might be enough. But if the notes aren't good, that could be a big problem. So yeah, I had enough variety, I think, with the quiz scores. And, I did several papers, 3 papers comparing individual note takers to collaborative note takers. And so the collaborative note takers outperformed individual note takers on measurements of recall. Interestingly, individual note takers outperform collaborative note takers on writing quality. One possible explanation could be that individual note takers did more encoding, and maybe that made them better able to apply a skill, or maybe it was just the fact that they wrote on average 7,000 more words during the course, and that writing practice was helpful. I think your second question was about qualitative information or qualitative data. So yeah, I did a survey, and I also conducted 13 interviews. And in some semesters, I was sort of comparing individual note-taking and collaborative note-taking for preference, and collaborative note-taking was substantially preferred. I was also sort of using I used the interviews to kind of help me understand the collaborative encoding processes students were using. Like, what were they thinking with these strategies? How did they feel about it? For instance, I wanted to know, obviously edits of others at the group level causes some negative effect on student learning. What was that? Is it like that they hated people changing their writing, or was it just that the notes got worse? And I was able to sort of tease some of that out in the interview process. I think I got some pretty useful information from that.
Thank you. Well, we can have a couple more questions before closing it. I thought like one thing probably some of the students, maybe the attending student will be interested in will be, so you, Mik, when you share all those pre-created kind of note space, the Google Doc with students, so apparently you collected their email addresses. So do you want to talk a little bit about logistics? We can think about the privacy or some of the ethical kind of issues so how that kind of, when it comes to ethics that you had to get the approval, how that played.
Okay. So I had to, so I needed everybody to have a Google account to participate in the study. And whether I was going to do the study or not, I needed them to have a Google account, because I use Google Docs for several collaborative activities in my class. Luckily, Google pretty commonly used, so most people already had a Google account, and I would, there was an app on my LMS where students could kind of give me that address, and also give me like some information about the type of research they were doing, their major, so I could help them. I would kind of know what kind of papers I was looking at. And as far as the ethics, I had to get, an IRB approval from both institutions, KAIST and Lancaster. And one thing that kind of helps with that is, the class was pass fail, and nobody fails. So it wasn't the riskiest of situations in that sense. There wasn't a lot of chance that they would be harmed. But the privacy of the notes, that's something that, I have access and control of the note-taking document. So I have to protect that. So there was some process about, locking my account with 2FA and some other things that were required. But I think it's kind of good that I have, that I'm the owner of the documents, because I can also keep them online for the students for as long as I want. As long as I'm working at KAIST, those will always be available for the students. Really, even if I'm not working at KAIST, I should still have the documents, and I can provide that. But yeah, one issue, of course, is that I can see what the students are doing. But on the other hand, my prior research experience with this topic tells me that if I can't see what the students are doing, then they're not doing anything. So that's sort of ended a lot of good studies in the past. And I think it's okay to kind of put eyes on the students, and also because, as you saw from the practitioner recommendations, if I'm not doing a study and I'm just being an instructor, I think that I want to encourage groups to make additive changes and to interact with each other when they take notes. And the only way to do that is to sort of be involved, to check their work, not only to make sure everybody's contributing, because we know that at the individual level, those encoding opportunities are super important, but we also know that we start to know what good note-taking looks like. And I think instructors can kind of be helpful to guide that process. In social constructivism, the instructor is a kind of guide, right? So I think that to be a guide, we have to be present, we have to see something, but that inevitably involves some privacy issues, I think.
Thank you. I think Anya has put her comment / provoking question. I think the question is interesting to look at. It's very difficult question. So do you want to have some say?
Yeah, I mean, it's fair. I know that Google's a big tech organization, and we have a lot of distrust of those organizations. Luckily, I never thought that anything in the documents was especially private. I mean, I think in part that's also the advantage of having the instructor look at the document, because they know that the instructor is looking at the document. They're aware somebody's watching, right? Now, the fact that Google could be using this data, it's real, and it's a sort of an issue we have with anything you do really with big tech, but it's also very hard to avoid. So I didn't really talk about this much with my students. I didn't, but I tried to make them aware that someone outside of their group, me, and my course TA as well, had access to their documents, that someone was watching. And so it's really just about coursework. But if this was more about like classroom chats or things like that, then it's more concerning. But I didn't really see that kind of sensitive information. But yes, I agree, this is an issue. It's just really hard to get around it, because you really need like some kind of central service that everybody is familiar with, they can use, and it's hard to make something like this yourself. So yeah, limited options, but I acknowledge the issue, certainly.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I think as long as we're critical about it, I mean, it's important to note. And then we have, let's just move on to next question. Jonathan, do you want to come in, please?
Yeah, thank you. Mik, thanks so much. That was a really, really interesting talk. And so I just was thinking about the kind of the applications of it a little bit. So in the context of your course that you were doing at KAIST, it was a kind of a pass-fail course. And so you can see that this kind of constructivist approach really had benefits, and what you presented was kind of demonstrated that really clearly. So I was just interested then in an institution like KAIST, as you described it, which is super competitive to get into, and then on other courses which might be not pass-fail, so therefore there's the stakes are higher. I'm just interested in sort of the applicability where suddenly, if I'm now a resource for my fellow student who I might perceive as a like it's a competition, I might perceive it in those terms. I'm just interested kind of where you see it going in those ways.
That is a good point, really good point. And I think that is something that I want to do in future research. So one of the things that I'm really looking to do now is, so obviously working at KAIST, I'm quite interested in STEM education, right? And so I'm very interested in STEM context, the science and engineering classroom. And I'm really curious how this will work outside of the limited context of my research writing class, where I'm the teacher and I made everything. And it's just research writing, and it's kind of a hodgepodge of different STEM majors, right? So I'm kind of looking now for, I'm actually trying to find, science and engineering professors at KAIST that are willing to take on this type of educational approach. So, and then also, so sort of letting me in their classroom, and then trying to find out what the results would be, because I don't know. I'm really curious how this will translate into other contexts. And the point you made about, classes where we have great, ABC grading and people are competing, it's interesting where that line will be drawn between cooperation and competition. I really don't know, but it's a great question, and I think it's worth exploring it.
Thanks. Yeah.
I think you're muted, Kyung-mi. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So those are all the questions that we got for the session. I have to say that Mik has just finished his PhD, and he will probably work on this area of the study for quite a long time from now on. So all this kind of comments and questions you receive, I'm pretty sure it was really helpful for us to be more sophisticated and thinking about different things and deepen this area of knowledge further. So it's not end of the word, but I really want to say one more time, congratulations for that. So by saying that, I think we can close the session. And I just wanted to make short announcement about the next online seminar. So which is going to be next week. Oh, is it? No, sorry. It's not next week. So it's January. So next term is Wednesday, 25th January 2023. So speaker will be Bakır Gür from Ankara Yıldırım Beyazıt University from Turkey. So I hope that I made some sense by saying these words, but very looking forward to it. We are waiting for the title, but the title will be soon announced. So thank you again for attending it, and thank you so much for Mik presenting it. Also, everyone have a lovely winter and great holiday, and take a rest before our next seminar. So I'll see you very soon.
Thanks for sharing, Kyung-mi. Thanks, Mik. It was really brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.